Well, this is Dr. Stan back here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story. Hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at and that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality, not illusion or delusion, that'll determine what the future will bring. And I need to remind you the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views, and well, for the next hour, they're going to be the views of Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief. And hi, Joel, how are we doing?
I'm just fine, Dr. Stan, now that I'm back in good cell phone range, and in fact, I'm here in California, not too far south from where you are.
All right, very good. Well, I'm glad you're here. We missed you last week, and there's so many things happening. I'm really fascinated to know which of those issues you're going to address in this week's World Affairs Brief.
Well, let's first of all talk about the War Powers Act. Obama is denying that we're at war with Libya. At first, it appeared as if the White House was going to thumb their nose at the War Powers Act, limiting Obama's unilateral military action in Libya to the statutory 60 days. This issue became more serious when Congressman Dennis Kucinich and about 10 other congressmen filed suit in federal court to enforce compliance. The 10 House members were Kucinich, Walter Jones, Republican of North Carolina, Howard Coble, North Carolina, John Duncan, Republican of Tennessee, Roscoe Bartlett of Maryland, John Conyers, Democrat of Michigan, Ron Paul, naturally, of Texas, Michael Capuano, Democrat of Massachusetts, and Tim Johnson, Republican of Illinois, and Dan Burton. Pretty good mix of conservative Democrats and Republicans. He filed the complaint for taking military action without first seeking congressional approval. The White House, or the House members, argued that the Obama administration overstepped its constitutional authority by authorizing the use of military force without first receiving approval from Congress. U.S. forces have now been involved in the Libyan campaign against Muammar Gaddafi for 88 days. Actually, it's now over 91 days. Critics argue that Obama violated the 1973 War Powers Resolution by failing to seek congressional approval. Now, the view coming from the White House is that the War Powers Act does not apply to them because the events are limited and don't rise to the level of hostility mentioned in the War Powers Act. I mean, this is incredible. Here you've bombed the hell out of a country and it doesn't arise to hostilities. The government has also falsely claimed that there are no troops on the ground. But the UK Guardian has photographic evidence of U.S. and NATO troops directing Libyan opposition forces on the ground. The U.S. also has troop ships offshore awaiting the orders to begin the assault. Obama's spokesman claimed that they're out of range of shore weapons, so they don't count either. I mean, it's just incredible, the parsing of words that they go through to justify this. Well, Alex Jones is Infowars.com. It's always on the cutting edge each day of breaking news that the mainstream media is anxious to suppress. They write there that Infowars.com has received an alarming report that within the ranks of the military stationed at Fort Hood, Texas, confirming plans to initiate the full-scale U.S.-led ground invasion in Libya and deploy troops by October. That would also involve the 2nd Marine Division, which I had, sources tell me, had received orders to deploy and were on shipboard in Libya already. Even as the Obama administration prepares to launch a full ground war in Libya while expanding its drone attacks inside Yemen and Pakistan, U.S. warships are being moved toward the Mediterranean coast of Syria, precisely in line with forecasts that came out of the Bilderberg Group as they met this week in Switzerland.
Now tell me, are the Bilderbergs in favor of this or not?
Yes, they are.
All right, fine, go ahead.
Well, Senator Rand Paul complained about the huge level of U.S. involvement and the cost, even as NATO claims to be running the show. Thus far, he writes,
Hold that thought. We'll be back in just a moment. Well, this is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty. Our guest this afternoon is Joel Skousen of World Affairs Brief, and he's talking about the fact that the president really doesn't answer to the laws. He doesn't answer to our elected representatives. And when he was asked why he had committed certainly American military forces to Libya without congressional approval, and of course the War Powers Act requires that he get congressional approval within 60 days, and we're over 90 days now. He says, well, we don't have any troops on the ground, because he's lying. But we really aren't at war. This is not a military conflict. Heavens, our planes are bombing, and people are dying, and of course NATO's doing this, and we supply 3/4 of the finances of NATO, so whether it's American planes or planes that are built and financed by American money, 3/4 of the budget of NATO comes from the United States. So basically, we are, for all intents and purposes, at war with Libya, and we are killing civilians, and, they said, no, we're there to protect the civilians, and that's why we're bombing this enclave and that enclave and killing civilians. We're there to protect them. But the interesting thing is President Obama has said, I do not have to answer to Congress. I'm carrying out a United Nations mandate. You pick up the story there.
Well, and that's Rand Paul's complaint, too. The son of Ron Paul is a senator. The United States, he said, has provided 93% of the cruise missiles fired, 66% of the personnel, 50% of the ships, and 50% of the planes in its Libyan mission. The resources totaling a cost of roughly $700 million, because I don't see any logic behind such expenditures. That's one of the weak points of the Paul family. They don't really understand the globalist motives for continually pushing us into war. Why is America asked at a time of economic emergency spending $700 million to support a war effort which is not yet of any interest to our nation's well-being? So Congress, he says, should not stand idly by indolently while a war of choice is being waged on our dime. America cannot financially or emotionally afford another war. Congress must put an end to it. It's our responsibility to defend the Constitution and the American people. Thus, I urge my colleagues to remember their loyalties and take this administration off its unnecessary war path. Sadly, too many in Congress, in my opinion, Stan, are under the thumb of the powers that be, too much so to fight against it. To make a legal case that the U.S. can go in and bomb a country and then direct others to carry on under our direct supervision and not have that count as hostile action towards another nation requiring congressional consent is stretching all credulity.
Hold that thought, Joel. We'll be back in just a moment here. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Joe was just pointing out that the Senator Rand Paul had pointed out, that we're picking up a majority of the expenses there, not only our expenses, but the expenses of the NATO countries. We are bombing, we're killing, and of course to say, well, of course, we're really not involved. But the problem is, where is the outcry? They only got 10 congressmen who are willing to sign a petition. I would think they would all sign a petition, and they would have demanded the impeachment of the president for violating the laws. The president is not above the law. The War Powers Act is the law of the land. He has to abide by it, but he said, I don't have to. I mean, after all, I will determine what is right and wrong. I am the commander-in-chief, and they're killing people. This is a war crime, and this ever went before the International Criminal Court. Why President Obama would be tried, convicted, and be subject to either long imprisonment or execution for what he's doing. But then our military are doing exactly the same thing. They're following what I believe are unconstitutional laws. But, of course, where is the outcry from the members of Congress? Even more than that, where is the outcry from our Christian leaders? In fact, most of the Republican leaders and most of the Republican leaders and conservative leaders are going right along with this. Because, after all, when we fight wars overseas, we must obviously be protecting America. I would like to see just the opposite is the case. We're antagonizing the whole world so that when the next war comes, we will have no friends at all. And when the next war ends, there's a serious question as to whether America will be victorious or defeated. And there's only one worse thing than fighting a war, and that is losing a war. Go right ahead, Joe.
Well, you know, the specific language of the White House sounds strangely like a continuation of Bill Clinton's haggling over what is means in the Monica Lewinsky affair, or the Bush lawyers redefining torture and calling it enhanced interrogation. Here's the language. The President is of the view that the current U.S. military operation in Libya is consistent with the War Powers Resolution and does not require, under the law, any further congressional authorization. I mean, this is incredible. In the first place, they've never gone for congressional authorization at all relative to this issue, so that itself is a strange use of legalese to say require further congressional. That implies that when Congress has given them any authorization under the War Powers Act, that it's unlimited. Further, he says U.S. military operations are distinct from the kind of, quote, hostilities contemplated by the resolution's 60-day termination provision. That's just literally incredible, almost unbelievable interpretation. Amazing what they can get away with and what the media will tolerate without putting up real opposition to counter this. But this is how the Constitution is eroded slowly. A provision becomes inconvenient, and the Congress passes an accommodation making it easier to get around it. The War Powers Act itself was a means to avoid the constitutional provision requiring that no military action be taken without a declaration of war by Congress. Now, even the softer War Powers Act appears to be too restrictive for our globalist leaders. Sadly, all this shows that powerful forces aren't about to let the, quote, goddamn piece of paper, quoting George W. Bush, get in the way of what they want. Now, I'm no fan of House Speaker John Boehner, but he said on Thursday that a White House argument that the United States was not in the middle of hostilities in Libya did not pass the straight face test. I mean, it's absolutely true. This is just laughable, Stan. Boehner told reporters that the White House letter lawmakers received Wednesday didn't make clear whether Barack Obama's legal advisors agreed that the Libyan conflict was too limited to require congressional authorization. He warned U.S. lawmakers that U.S. lawmakers still had options for dealing with the Libyan conflict, including the power of the purse, that is, cutting off funding for the war. In the end, all the House could do was to vote to defund the war in Libya, but that's hard to enforce since the Pentagon can draw from any number of slush funds in order to continue. Besides, the more liberal Senate will hardly go along with the House on this issue.
I agree with you, and basically, I would think this would be grounds for impeachment, but I'm sure that John Boehner would never go along with that, because basically he's really just playing a part. It's all political theater to give the people the idea that our elected representatives have some say. The decisions are made by the internationalists. They want us in this war, and I fear that this war is going to expand. This is just how we got into sort of Vietnam War. They'll create an incident, a phony incident, like they did at the sort of the Gulf of Tonkin, and then they killed 58,000 soldiers over a contrived phony incident, and nobody's ever held responsible. Go right ahead.
Well, let's change topics and talk about the Republican primary. It's building in complexity. It's always fascinating to me, Stan, watching the political process during the season leading up to a major party primary. In few other ways do we get a front row seat to media and polling attempts to manipulate public opinion. And manipulation gives us several hints to where the political kingmakers want to take us. So far, the manipulation this season doesn't approach the obvious media hijinks of 2008, when 6 major newspapers simultaneously came out and endorsed John McCain in one fell swoop, boosting his polling numbers from low single digits to double digits overnight. All this was done to ensure that the disastrous showing of the favorite at that time, Rudy Giuliani, didn't leave a gaping political vacuum that would accrue to the favor of upstart, self-financed candidate Mitt Romney. But for all their successful efforts to derail Romney's candidacy in 2008, he now sits in the one-to-beat column and is likely to be a strong contention throughout the primary battle. Romney not only has a fair amount of charisma, but the establishment is warming up to Romney as someone they might be able to control if elected. Since Romney's defeat for the nomination in 2008, he's increased his effort to please the establishment, showing that the fatal flaw of principle that the establishment powers to be looked to really see if a person wants to get elected too badly. And this makes Republican compromises particularly useful to the controllers because, when you can get Republican conservatives to convince people that a compromise towards warmongering or socialism is proper, it's easier to get people to go along, or conservatives especially, to go along than if Obama tries to convince them to do so. Well, the recent South Carolina debate wasn't a good first test, as many of the major candidates declined to participate. This past week's New Hampshire debate, however, while not very exciting, was certainly more indicative of the relative strength of each candidate. The Rasmussen polling company polled likely GOP voters, which included both Republicans and independent voters, supposedly likely to vote in the GOP primary, which is a questionable group to include, but that's the way they do to manipulate polls. But they produced some interesting results anyway. Former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney, they said, continues to lead the race for the Republican nomination, but Michelle Bachmann has surged in second place following her Monday night entry into the campaign. A new Rasmussen report reports national telephone survey of people likely to vote, as I said, in the Republican primaries, and showing Romney earning 33% support, with Minnesota Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann a surprise second at 19%. Georgia businessman Herman Cain is in third place with 10%. A lot of difference between 33%, 20%, and 10%. Former House Speaker Newt Gingrich picks up 9%. This must be a real disappointment to the establishment. He is their favorite. He's their Rudolph Giuliani this time around, which has never showed double-digit support. He may be headed for the same fate as Giuliani. He was followed by Texas Congressman Ron Paul with 7%, ex-Minnesota Governor Tim Pawlenty with 6%. That's a dismal showing for the governor, who seems to lack charisma and the ability to excite his audience. Former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum earned 6%. Which, Santorum is the arch neocon of the group, and it's a good thing that he isn't performing well. Former Utah Governor John Huntsman, who did not participate in the debate but is expected to announce his candidacy next Tuesday, gets 2% of the vote. Well, the survey reveals more detail as it analyzes support from core Republican conservatives. Romney and Bachmann are tied among primary voters who say that the Tea Party members with 26% support each. Romney holds a 36 to 16% lead over the congresswoman among non-members. So among the Tea Party, each one of them has voted as 26% support. But among mainstream Republicans, Romney needs more. You can tell that they're not as ideologically concerned as people who view themselves as Tea Party members. Most primary supporters regard all the candidates, with the exception of Huntsman, as conservative, and that's probably because Huntsman isn't known. He isn't conservative to be true, but Bachmann seems the most conservative. However, when you read the survey questions, you see that the callers are asking people to rate each candidate on a fairly long list of who's conservative and who isn't. Few people can speak knowledgeable about how conservative every candidate in a list is. And being conservative is a fairly murky and imprecise term anyway. Moderate conservatives view their brand of conservatives far different than constitutional conservatives. It was even worse responding to questions about how the entrance of certain other candidates would have on the burgeoning Republican candidate field. Rasmussen said a plurality of Republican primary voters think it would be good for Texas Governor Rick Perry to jump into the presidential race, and bad for the party if former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin joins the field. They are evenly divided about former New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani.
You wonder how accurate these polls are, if they sort of make them up as they go along to come up with the conclusions they want rather than with a feeling of people.
That's right.
Go right ahead.
Well, I think these are meaningless questions and almost meaningless responses. How would any common person know how a certain candidacy would affect the party as a whole? It's just not a good question, especially asked off the top of their head.
Hold that thought. We're going to be back here in just a moment with Joel Skousen, right here at Radio Liberty. Joel, go right ahead.
So again, we see the establishment continuing to tempt people about Rudolph Giuliani, who couldn't get to first base in 2008, and I don't think it's going to work this time either. I don't think it's going to work that Newt Gingrich is going to get the nod. So only certain limitations in which they can manipulate public opinion, especially when there's a groundswell against rhino Republicans, as there is among the core constituency of the conservatives in the Republican Party. In a recent Reuters poll, Congressman Paul, the favorite of all constitutional conservatives, received 8% of the vote, while Texas Governor Rick Perry received 5%. Perry is being promoted by several news outlets as the media continues to try and flood the field with candidates. Former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin led the Reuters survey with 19%, which indicates they were polling a fairly conservative audience, not the general public as a whole, as the Rasmussen's poll was. Perry is one of the most dangerous political chameleons on the market, not because he's in the same deceptive league as globalist wolf in sheep's clothing Newt Gingrich, but because his youngish good looks and right-wing rhetoric are so disarming to Texas people who fail to see the huge gap between rhetoric and actions. They want to believe him. With a hint of George W. Bush's drawl, he is capable of pandering to the don't tread on me Texas crowd and yet working tirelessly behind the scenes to undermine U.S. sovereignty with his Trans-Texas corridor in behalf of the globalist North American Union. This is a guy who can preach secession of Texas from the Union in one breath and accept a secret invitation to New World Order Bilderberg Group in the next. Sarah Palin's negative numbers within the Republican survey indicate that despite her coy and alluring good looks, mainstream Republicans are losing confidence that she is a competent candidate. And they're right. She isn't a competent candidate. I can't believe that she'd be so stupid as to go pandering to the door of Henry Kissinger to sit at his feet and receive counsel. That's just the kind of, go-along person that we don't need. I wouldn't count Palin out yet, however, especially as a vice presidential candidate. She still is being promoted by the folks at Fox News and could be very useful in giving Republicans that uncertain sound that might lead to an Obama re-election. As I have been stating in recent briefs, it does appear that the powers that be are going to give Obama another term. I base that upon the extreme efforts they went to in falsifying his birth certificate and the death of Osama bin Laden, which accrued to his own popularity. If this is true, we have to look at the way the Republican field is being promoted, not as who the public powers that be might want, but rather who they would want to help lead a Republican defeat at the polls. I think that's a very important concept to keep in mind. But even a losing campaign is a chance to give wide coverage to a variety of good or bad ideas. So it's important to the kingmakers that Ron Paul not be given much airtime because he gets out too much truth. In contrast, as Romney begins to move toward the center to please the establishment, he is rewarded with more coverage and much of it favorable. Romney just might be allowed to win the nomination precisely because he's willing to trumpet the kind of mainstream garbage that the media loves to hear, like global warming and continued foreign military intervention. It might also be the best way to discourage Romney from running a third time by making him a loser at the polls in 2012. Now, I doubt it, given his raging ambition, that they could stop him from running again. Even Al Gore couldn't help but praise Romney's pain.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back here. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and of course Joel is simply saying that the establishment might be willing to encourage Mitt Romney to run and hopefully get the Republican nomination so that he could be defeated and so that they would be able to get Obama in for a second term. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, everything is being done to control your reality. They want you to go to the polls every 4 years to vote for the candidates of their choice. And it really doesn't matter too much which one wins. Their candidate, which one loses, their candidate always wins. So they control them both. But it's going to be very interesting to see how this thing plays out. Go right ahead, Joe.
Well, even Al Gore couldn't help but praise Romney's pandering to the man-made climate change forum. Gore posted a note on his blog that praised Romney, which wouldn't happen, frankly, if Romney was still viewed as a real danger to the globalist agenda. I mean, if Ron Paul came out, they wouldn't be praising him. They wouldn't want to give him anything at all because they know that they couldn't trust him. On the global student, I think they're beginning to trust Romney. Not that he's one of them, but that he is so, eager to please that they can control him. He said, good for Romney, though we've long passed the point where weak lip service is enough on the climate crisis. While other Republicans, Gore wrote, are running from the truth, Romney is sticking to his guns in the face of the anti-science wing of the Republican Party. Well, the only anti-science wing on Earth is the one defying all of the growing evidence that man-made global warming is an outright hoax and a lie. Even conservative talk show host Rush Limbaugh, who's a phony conservative in my opinion, declared that Republican presidential hopeful Mitt Romney has no chance to win the primary because he believes in man-made climate change. In short, bye-bye nomination. Well, I'm not so sure. I still think that the powers that be may well let him win just to have him lose the election. Let's talk a little bit about now the New Hampshire debates. The CNN-sponsored debates showed from the beginning that this mainstream media company was more interested in show than substance. When the New York Times complained that no candidate had anything important to say, we can lay most of the blame on the format of these debates, which don't allow substantive answers, and the way in which questions are phrased. Connor Murphy of the Washington Times had these observations. He says it was a debate that saw plenty of pandering, flip-flopping, red meat, and fear-mongering. CNN attempted to lighten the mood of the debate with some this or that questions, but they probably did little to stir any excitement from voters. Listeners were agonized by the silliness of it all. While the debate moderator John King seemed very concerned about applause and answers taking up too much time, he seemed quite all right with useless questions such as wanting to know a candidate's preferred soft drink or a musical artist. I mean, it was just horrible. The winner of the night, who also was the winner of the first Republican debate, was Ron Paul. At least a few times, some of the candidates referenced Ron Paul in their answers, and even the moderator referred people to Ron Paul's position and see what they thought of it. Of course, they were trying to target and get people to agree that they didn't like Ron Paul's non-interventionist foreign policy. But it kept, it was a mistake because it kept putting Ron Paul in a position of authority. Dr. Paul was not as exciting, says Connor Murphy, as he was in the South Carolina debate, but was able to refrain from giving himself a bad image, something none of the other candidates were able to do. Well, I disagree there. Michelle Bachmann made few mistakes and came off with a definite positive image. Paul was not his best and sounded a little bit strident, often because he rarely gets the proper time to present his case with sufficient ease so that he could slow down. Michelle Bachmann got the ball rolling by dodging the first question that was asked of her. When she was asked about Wall Street and whether or not they needed oversight, she instead took the opportunity to announce that she was officially running for president. Now, this was a pre-planned tactic that requires that you pick a question that you're knowingly going to disregard, and then you insert your propaganda statement piece. So it's natural if that's the answer she picks to evade so that she can make her announcement, that's what she's going to do. This seemed to be an obvious attempt to shift the focus away from the question and bring attention to herself, but no one seemed to care at all. And that's because it was a brilliant tactic and she got a good response. The audience in these debates are generally much more conservative than voters in general and responded to both Ron Paul and Bachmann with loud applause. Romney once again voiced his support for the repeal of Obamacare and backed off the assertion that the supported national health care system, even though the bill was taken from the plan he implemented in Massachusetts. Well, it really wasn't taken from the plan, but it's a convenient thing to blame on him, and he is to blame for having instituted an individual mandate.
Well, because he very, very clever. He said, but this is a state. I'm not pushing for a national, just a state. Right. After all, they don't like it, they can repeal it. Well, I think a lot of people in Massachusetts like to repeal Romney Care. We're going to be back in just a moment with certainly Joel Skousen, World Affairs Brief, here at Radio Liberty.
While the storm clouds gather
Well, Joel, you go right ahead.
Well, none of the other candidates on the debate wished to challenge the former governor on this issue. Everyone was too focused on attacking Obama, who's an easy target, and they were not focusing enough on distinguishing themselves from each other, except for Ron Paul, who is clearly distinguishable. After all, that's the purpose of these debates, to distinguish themselves, not to all sit around and attack Obama. Herman Cain, former Godfather's piece, that provided more flip-flopping when he backtracked on his support for TARP. When the concept of TARP, he said, was first presented to the public, I was willing to go along with it. But then when the administration started to implement it on a discretionary basis, picking winners and losers and also directing funds to General Motors and others that had nothing to do with the financial system, that's where I totally disagreed. Well, the problem with that statement is that Keynes still acknowledged that he thinks it was acceptable to pump money into banks that were failing in order to prevent a financial collapse. This is a clear contradiction of principles because in the same statement he professed a strong disagreement with picking winners and losers. Newt Gingrich and Tim Pawlenty got their share of cheers, but also had some negative moments when their positions were compared to the current president's policies. When Gingrich was asked about health care mandates, a position he had flirted with himself, the former liberal history professor quickly voiced his opposition to mandated government health care. But you know darn well he would go along with it if he were in office. Tim Pawlenty, meanwhile, was asked whether he agreed with Congressman Paul about ceasing the bombings on Yemen, or if he sided with the president and his policy of continuing the bombings. Although not referencing Dr. Paul or President Obama, Pawlenty answered by mentioning the September 11th attacks that if there were targets in Yemen, then we should continue the attacks, showing his susceptibility to the continuing neocon rhetoric that war on terror justifies everything, that reigns still within the mainstream Republican circles. Although Rick Santorum espoused support for Medical Plan B, one of the largest expansions of government under the Bush administration, this was not his greatest folly in the debate.
Hold that thought. Hold his thought. We'll be back here in just a moment. Well, this is Dr. Stan. Chris Joel is discussing the debate, and he was talking about Rick Santorum, former senator, and he's really going right along with the neocon agenda. He's all in favor of all of these wars, and I've met Nick Santorum, and I think he really doesn't understand. He certainly seems to be going right along with the globalist agenda. He says all the right things on the pro-life issue, but on so many of the other issues, he's absolutely on the wrong side, especially in his support for George Bush and his genocidal wars. Genocidal because, of course, they're killing people there totally unnecessarily. And anybody who supports those shares the responsibility for all the people, the million or more who've died unnecessarily. Go right ahead. What are your thoughts on Nick Santorum?
Well, I agree. I was just, I'm really afraid of Santorum because he just gets rabid about intervening around the world. He always brandishes terror. He is always trying to get an attack on Iran moving. So I think this is a very dangerous person. I don't think he's got any traction. He doesn't have the charisma to get ahead. And his low numbers in the polls showed that he'll probably bow out within after the next debate. Congressman Ron Paul may not have been flashy, but his answers had substance at least. He never contradicted himself, nor did he say anything that might have scared away an entire demographic of voters, as he did in South Carolina, where they purposely threw a drug legalization question to him about heroin, and he responded quite directly that he didn't agree with the war on drugs, that it was a matter of free choice as long as they didn't violate other people's rights. But still, that turns off a lot of conservatives, and that's why they threw that question out toward him. Now, this couldn't be said about Herman Cain, who acknowledged that he would be uncomfortable appointing a Muslim to his cabinet for fear that they might be some kind of Muslim that want to kill us. Not only did the congressman perform well at the debate, going back to talking about Ron Paul, but his ideas have traction in the electorate who are fed up with what they're getting from both parties. He received one of the louder ovations of the night for his comment on two of the wars we're fighting in the Middle East. He said we should spend more time defending our own borders instead of the borders between Iraq and Afghanistan. He probably should have meant Pakistan and Afghanistan. Ron Paul is the only candidate who is consistently right on all of the issues, although he has taken a position, kind of a pro-amnesty position recently in his newest book, which I disagree with. It isn't because he's bought into the globalist agenda at all. It's because of his libertarian background, and essentially that philosophy allows for free and open borders as long as you have other legal structures in place so that people are required to not settle in on property that they don't have, etc. But he has a long record of voting to defend the Constitution, was the only candidate on stage who had any substance in what he was saying. For these reasons and many more, he receives my full endorsement, as I did endorse him in 2008. Sadly, substance isn't what wins elections anymore, and we'll see Ron Paul continually undermined. It is my feeling that one of the reasons for putting out so many people into the campaign is just to have Ron Paul get lost within the crowd. And then they'll have an excuse, of course, to cut down the debate to people who poll over 15%, and Ron Paul will not poll over 15% in any of the polls, and so he'll be eliminated early on from the debate. I
would hope that if he were, he'd run as an independent, and that would be a very interesting thing to see. Go ahead.
Well, I think this is his last run. So if he's going to run as an independent and he doesn't have to preserve his Republican position anymore, this would probably be the time to do it. So I think we'd probably have more chance of convincing him to do that this time, although he's older this time, and it's more difficult for him to handle the rigors of an independent campaign.
Well, Jesse Ventura, I've heard Jesse say he would run as Ron Paul's vice president, but only if he ran as an independent. So let's see what happens. I think that would be something the other side would really fear, because Ventura does, imperfect as he is very articulate and very confrontational.
Well, I would agree with confrontational. I don't think he's anywhere near as articulate as Ron Paul, and would not be a good vice president. I mean, it certainly would pull in a certain blue-collar class to it, but I think there would be a better choice. I think Ron Paul and Pastor Chuck Baldwin would be a dynamite team.
Well, you may very well be correct. We'll have to wait to see how it unfolds. Go ahead.
Well, my next part of this story is watch out for John Huntsman. While Romney may enjoy the current position of front-runner, former Utah Governor John Huntsman is being strongly promoted from a variety of mainstream sources, and that's not by accident. He's even worse than Romney in terms of desire to please the establishment, in his ambition, his lack of consistent political principles. This was recently highlighted by Politico.com, which is even though it's a little bit liberal, it's a very good site about really boring in on the political issues. As the governor of Utah, John Huntsman, they write, said he was comfortable with the idea of an individual mandate for health insurance and signed a bill requiring his state to study the costs and benefits of one. As a soon-to-declare Republican presidential candidate, Huntsman rails against the individual mandate in the Democrats' health overhaul bill and says he never supported one in Utah. Well, Huntsman's critics correctly accuse him of flip-flopping, but healthcare experts who worked with him as governor say it's a little bit controversial. For example, John T. Nielsen, who was Huntsman's most senior health policy advisor during the 2007 negotiations with the legislature that led to Utah's health care reform bill, says that the former governor might have supported an individual mandate if his staff had called for one. We talked about the mandate. It was clearly part of the discussions. I can't deny that, Nielsen said. He never did. That is, the governor never did say, I want to see a mandate. But if we had recommended the mandate and thought it was the best way, he would have gone along with it. Well, Utah's voters have seen the way he operates very much dislike his support of cap-and-trade, civil unions for gay couples, and his support for in-state tuition for illegal immigrants. He also supported the stimulus packages of Congress and complained that they weren't big enough. Like Romney, Huntsman hints that he accepts the man-made global warming claim. Even worse is Huntsman's refusal to own up to his Mormon heritage. One can understand his reluctance to avoid the grilling Romney took for being a Mormon, but at least Romney had the courage to stand up for his religion and give a major speech about it. In contrast, Huntsman won't even admit to being a faithful member, which must be embarrassing to his father and his grandfather, who's an apostle for the church, both, of course, who hold high leadership positions. In an interview with Forbes, he evaded the question of what religion he belonged to, preferring to say that his religion was, quote, hard to define. Well, if any religion is not hard to define, it's Mormonism. It's very clear and distinct from other forms of Christianity. Utahns were stunned by his evasion ban. He received a lot of bad press in the state for his lack of moral courage. Thus, it is a little wonder that Huntsman decided recently to start admitting to his Mormon roots. In May of this year, he told the local ABC station, "I believe in God, I'm a good Christian, and I am very proud of my Mormon heritage. I am a Mormon." But then he began to waffle again and hint that he was still, quote, hard to define. He says, today there are 13 million Mormons. It's a very diverse and heterogeneous cross-section of people. I probably add to that diversity. So anxious is Huntsman to play to the establishment line that he has almost totally denied that China is a future threat. In an interview with Reuters, editor Harry Evans, sitting next to former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, he opined that Chinese Marxism is dead. No one who has served as ambassador to China could actually believe that. Even those who naively believe that China's affairs with a limited form of capitalism will keep them from attacking the West acknowledge that the communist government is very aggressive and still very much in control. It is therefore not surprising that Huntsman was praised by arch globalist Henry Kissinger, as reported in the Washington Times. They said former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger on Wednesday praised soon-to-be presidential candidate John Huntsman Jr. as intelligent and a very good ambassador to China. Well, coming from the man who sold out America to China at the end of the Vietnam War, that can't be good.
No, I saw that, and I just shuddered when I thought, what a person to be getting praise from. I think even George Soros has said good things about Mr. Huntsman.
Yeah. Well, this is very sad, and unfortunately, their state governments are more and more selling out to China. While ambassador to China, Huntsman lured his former lieutenant governor, Gary Herbert of Utah, to come to China with a delegation, which resulted in a formal trade liaison. As the New American pointed out, Utah's Governor Gary Herbert, who led an April 2011 trade delegation to Beijing and Shanghai, said he was amazed by the scale of Chinese development and construction and impressed by the business community's embracement of free market principles. Well, Utah will host governors from China's provinces at the U.S. National Governors Association in Salt Lake City this July. Herbert started out fairly conservative when Governor Huntsman resigned in order to take up the ambassadorial position to China, but now he's treading the path of the two former liberal Republican governors, Michael Leavitt, who had become Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and John Huntsman. We haven't seen the last of either, in my opinion. I think former Governor Mike Leavitt and Cabinet member Mike Leavitt will attempt to run for Senator Hatch's seat when he retires and continue the liberal Hatch tradition. That is, if Hatch survives a primary challenge, which is almost surely to come up this next year. A lot of states are taking trade trips to China, trying to lure Chinese money into their nearly bankrupt state coffers. But no one tops the idiocy of Idaho, who just recently sealed a deal with China, giving them exclusive development rights to prime property south of the Boise airport, totaling 30,000 acres. Idaho is a very conservative state, and the reaction to Governor Otter has been less than positive. The Idaho statesman interviewed several citizens displeased with the governor's overtures to China and the state's special tax breaks that are inducing China to develop this 10,000 to 30,000 acre technology park, retail centers, and homes. In fact, they've got some kind of model international homes that they're trying to design for this. I just see it now. Come and live in a little bit of China south of Boise, Idaho. Well, the Idaho statement says some of their fears are straightforward. Gresham Boma, a small building contractor who ran an unsuccessful campaign as a Republican for the Idaho Senate, expressed concern about giving Chinese immigrants investment preferences to Idaho businesses. He also worried about the strategic implications of a major Chinese development right next to the airport where the Idaho National Guard is based. He said, "We know the Chinese firms send spies over here." Well, the New American article also detailed the tax incentive, which has always proved illusory in producing a net profit to local communities when you factor in the high cost of infrastructure improvement and the traffic congestion that comes with fast growth. They write, this Project 60, as it's called, will facilitate the immigration of Chinese nationals into the United States for the purpose of establishing a Chinese industrial beachhead in Idaho under the guise of creating jobs. Second phase involves the granting of tax breaks to foreign companies, all of which are owned by the Chinese government. In exchange for an investment of between a paltry $500,000 to $1 million, depending on whether the tax zone is rural or urban, the foreign investor receives massive tax incentives. In addition, there is a special provision called EB-85, which allows Chinese officials to facilitate American jobs to get automatic U.S. residency. Well, Chinese is anxious to establish commercial beachheads on American soil for two reasons. One, it provides a much more useful outlet for dollars that China is accumulating as opposed to buying U.S. Treasury bonds. Trading dollars for commodities and U.S. land ensures appreciation. China fully intends to attack the U.S. someday and harness the U.S. economy under the yoke of Chinese control. Defectors have repeatedly warned of this, even though the Chinese government and the U.S. government deny it. I covered in the brief a recent visit by a Chinese general saying that the Chinese military never intends to challenge the U.S. I mean, if that isn't the philosophy of Sun Tzu, feigning weakness before a war, I don't know what is. A preparatory strategy involves revolves acquiring commercial bases of operation which can serve as staging points for future military activity, especially ports and airports. And China is deeply involved in surrounding the United States with buying up ports, Long Beach, California, Panama, and the Bahamas. It's a real encirclement strategy.
I will never forget that saying of Sun Tzu, to fight and conquer in all of your battles is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists of defeating the enemy without fighting. And that's exactly what the Chinese communists are doing today with the full help, financial support of the American establishment. Go right ahead.
Well, in other news, Czechoslovakia is pulling out of the Missile Defense Treaty with the United States under pressure of Russia, I'm sure. I have documented in the World Affairs Brief how the so-called Václav Havel and other anti-communists who took over Czechoslovakia afterward were in fact still Soviet agents. They continued to hide the fact that Russia still had missiles within Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Bulgaria, even after 10 or 15 years after the intermediate treaty forces, when they were supposed to have withdrawn them all. And certainly these anti-communists would have known that as president of the country, but they said nothing. So it's a very interesting point. The root of contention in Czechoslovakia is that there was the awareness that it, by hosting a missile and radar system as part of the not Patriot system, but the Aegis land-based anti-ballistic missile system, makes them an increased target of Soviet aggression in the next war, and they're absolutely right. But I'm sure that was noted fairly pointedly to them in consultations with Russians diplomats who are in Czechoslovakia. So I think that the European Union sees the United States as an unreliable ally. Robert Gates was talking to the NATO last week, claiming that he fears that NATO is breaking up, that they're not shouldering their full responsibilities, they've got too much infighting. And it sounds to me like they need another war to bring them to a unity of the faith about globalism, and that's where we're headed.
And it's so hard, Joel, for the average individual to believe that this could be coming. And yet, of course, it was certainly Plato, and General MacArthur quoted him as saying, only the dead have seen the end of war, and unfortunately our leaders are doing everything they can to build up the military and financial potential of our coming enemies. They know exactly what they're doing. None of this makes sense unless you understand their powerful secret forces working behind the scenes that seem to be intent upon preparing for a worldwide, I think it'll be a nuclear confrontation. Hope and pray that I'm wrong. Our guest, of course, is Joel Skousen. We'll be back here in just a moment to wrap up today's program. Well, Joel, I got so interested in what you were saying, I forgot to give you the opportunity to get out information on how people can get your information.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Stan. The World Affairs Brief is showcased on my website, worldaffairsbrief.com. People can get a free sample issue by emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. The current issue on the website is why most doomsday scenarios never don't pan out, especially as to timing, and I go through a great many of the extremely hyped-up claims that are going on about an imminent collapse in the economy and why that isn't going to occur. I discuss a lot of the topics about HAARP-induced earthquakes and why that really isn't possible right now, and it's just an awful lot of conflict within the movement because of people taking advantage of other people's gullibility and hyping false conspiracy theories, which discredits all the true ones that we really need to be concerned about. I think it's also important that people take a look at books that I have written in my past career as a high-security architect. I think we are going to face war someday, and I think as we're trying to fight for our liberty, we also ought to prepare for a military conflict, a possible war, and a takedown. We have to survive to be able to live another day to preserve the remnant and the liberty that we've been given. So my 3 books on the subject are The Secure Home, 700 pages, everything about high-security construction and remodeling and self-sufficiency. My bestseller is Strategic Relocation, North American Guide to Safe Places. The new 3rd edition is out with about 75% new material, including colored maps and a section on international retreats. And the 3rd book is How to Implement a High-Security Shelter in the Home, a architectural plan book on how to do a safe room in an existing basement. And all 3 of those books are available from Radio Liberty.
By calling 1-800-544-8927. Go right ahead.
Well, and then I can just say that we're eventually heading for war. It's very obvious that we're never going to end this series of creating conflict within the world, and eventually someone's going to try to take down the bully of the world, and I think those 2 are going to be Russia and China.
Well, we're just going to have to wait and see how this scenario plays out, but I think we're moving into very, very difficult times, and certainly I think probably the next major point of confrontation, even expanding from what we already have today, will be the Near East and the Middle East. What are your thoughts?
Oh, yes, certainly. I think we're going to have a Middle East war, but I think that eventually the target still is Iran, and the establishment is denying it, but Israel, we still get all kinds of information coming out of Israel.
Hold that thought. Well, this is Dr. Stan. What were you saying? We're going to have to let you go, but what were you saying about the information coming out of Israel?
That they are still planning for the attack and that it will be sometime this year.
All right, fine. Well, I hope and pray you're wrong, but I fear you may be right. Anyway, God bless. We'll talk to you tomorrow morning. Thanks so much. Bye-bye. Okay, that was Joel Skousen, and certainly we do carry his 3 books, Strategic Relocation, The Secure Home, and How to Make a Safe Home, safe room in your home. All 3 books are available by calling 1-800-544-8927. 1-800-544-8927. How do you understand what's going on in the world today? Very, very simple. There is a small clique of people, perhaps 6,000 or more, who make up the Brotherhood of Darkness. You need to get my book, Brotherhood of Darkness. You need to hear our talk on the secret, the forbidden secret, and the dark secret, and the latter 2 come with certainly syllabuses. You need, of course, to Understand we're involved in a spiritual battle that is being fought on a political, ideological, and cultural battlefield. Excellent DVDs would be What in the World Are They Spraying? Weather as a Warfare, book. It's a DVD by our good friend Bob Fletcher. Cancer, Forbidden Cures. In other words, they have cures for cancer, and they're suppressing them because it's an excellent means of population control. You need to get my talk on planned population reduction, on none dare call it genocide or simply population control. You need to read the Master Plan, Agenda 21, published by the United Nations. They're not publishing it now, but we want to help them out, so we're publishing it. We make it available. You need to get our Sustainable Development Syllabus because it contains a summary of the Global Biodiversity Assessment, which is one of the 4 legs of the stool upon which the future of humanity rests. The other 2 are the Georgia Guidestones and, of course, the Earth Charter, and they're all in the Sustainable Development Syllabus. You go get 3 of the 4 major things you need to understand there. Agenda 21, the Master Plan for the 21st Century. They want to cut back on your use of electricity. That's what the smart meters are all about. We got a great book on smart meters. We've got, of course, a great 4-tape set on smart meters and what you need to know. Then, of course, we have information on all sorts of other things. We have certainly Arlene Kula's excellent book by Stealth and Deception, because everything is stealth and deception. They can't let you common people understand. There is a master agenda. They intend to impoverish our people and destroy this nation. They want to cut back on your use of water. That's why they're taking out the dams. That's why they block building new dams. That's why they said they've done everything they could to block an adequate water policy. They want to run up the cost of electricity. That's what the smart meters are all about. They said they want to run up the cost of oil, which is why they blocked their the drilling in Anwar, Arctic Anwar, and incidentally they have recently authorized it, knowing full well the price of oil is going through the roof here in the next couple of years, and it'll take a couple of years before that oil will be on board. And of course, they want the oil for the coming war. They want us to have access to it. So after funding the environmental movement, and that they get them to block drilling at Anwar and off the North Slope and all the other areas, now very quietly they're beginning to drill for oil. So we'll have oil for the next war. Who do you think funds the environmental movement? Well, the oil companies, of course, but that doesn't make sense. Of course it makes sense if you understand that if you can prevent the development of oil, the price goes up. It's really very simple, but they make it complicated. Our number 1-800-544-8927, 1-800-544-8927. Please pray for Radio Liberty.